good afternoon, everybody. If you're on the East Coast, good morning. If you're on the West Coast, my name is Justin Harford, project coordinator with NCDE. Thanks for joining us for this session today. The goal of this session is, okay, so we've got a panel here to speak to you of representatives from 3 different providers of exchange programs or exchange opportunities. And in some way or another, each of them has excelled in supporting people with disabilities on their programs. And supporting might mean providing resources like interpreters. It might just mean collaboration, like working with somebody to get a policy change, like a 1.5 time on an exam. And sometimes when you get these panels, you can get the impression that all these folks, they started off and built everything from scratch and then they just started and everything was ready. In reality, it's an evolution. It happens over time. And the goal of this panel discussion is to illustrate to you how that evolution takes place. And without any further ado, I think what I'd like to We're going to go ahead and start with Erika Wang first.
Sure. Hi. So I'm Erika. I'm the project coordinator at the Watson Foundation. So I work on new initiatives, but also get to work on a lot of our diversity and inclusion work at the foundation. At Watson, we expand the vision and develop the potential of remarkable students. And so we have 2 programs. One is the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, which is a 1-year grant of purposeful exploration. Applicants are graduating seniors who conceive of an original project and choose where they're going to go and who they're going to meet over that year. The Jeanette K. Watson Fellowship is a 3-year program of fully funded summer internships, and those fellows are selected as either freshmen or sophomores in college and continue with us until they're juniors or seniors.
Thanks, Erika. Laura.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Colludas. I'm a senior program coordinator with Texas Global at the University of Texas at Austin. I started there in 2015 working on faculty-led programs as a program coordinator, and currently I work in the Special Initiatives Unit on a program called the President's Award for Global Learning, which is a grant-funded program that supports interdisciplinary teams of faculty and students collaborating with international partners, working in project-based teams. So that's what I'm currently working on.
Thank you, Laura. Teneisha.
Hi, I'm Teneisha Ellis. I am the former study abroad advisor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where we developed a program called Enable Abroad, which helps students identify with a disability to be able to go abroad for a semester or a summer, and identifying locations where those would be feasible. The last 3 years, I've been the director of education abroad at the University of Northern Colorado, and currently I'm a PhD student in Scotland in psychology.
Thank you, Teneisha. So as I mentioned, this isn't starting off where a program has everything in place, where they get around a table and they plan all the possibilities and they just make a procedure for every single outcome. Instead, it's an evolution that takes place over time. And for many of you, it started with one student when you kind of realized that you wanted to start making these steps to try to enhance your processes for working with or for supporting people with disabilities on your programs. And so I'd like to go back to Teneisha and ask if you could tell us about that student in broad terms, what reasonable accommodations they asked for, and we'll go into informational resources once we kind of cover the basics of the student. So why don't you start, Teneisha?
I think the most important thing is to ask questions, because the first student I worked with, the University of Illinois is over 50,000 students, and generally we accept students without even seeing them until pre-departure. There was a student I had a question about. He had mentioned like the weight of something, and I wanted to meet with him, and I asked him to come into my office. He kept saying, oh, I'll come soon, but he never came in. And finally, I'm like, you have to come or you won't be able to go. And when he came in, he was actually in a wheelchair. And he said that he was afraid that I would say that he could not go on this program if he had told me previously, because he met all the requirements. It's just that the weight of his chair is different, or the activities were different. The program he wanted, we got the language he wanted. We just needed to go to a different location. But that lasted. He had to wait a semester because he waited so long to tell the study abroad office what his needs were. So I want to tell you guys right now, put the needs first. Go into your office, talk to people, let them know that these are the resources that you need, and generally they can find a location that would fit what you can do independently as well.
Thanks, Teneisha. And let's go on to apologies. Let's Laura, why don't you tell us about that first student as well? And also, just as a side note, the student that Teneisha is referring to is Hugo Trevino, and I only share that because we did write a story about Hugo, and I'd be happy to share that link with you in the chat box. So, and Laura, why don't you tell us?
Sure, thank you. So yeah, my experience working with disability access and inclusion really began when I was working on a faculty-led program in Mexico City, summer program, and there was a student attending who was in a wheelchair. So we were kind of looking at the program, and we had to look at all aspects of the program and think about the accessibility for this student. So we had to look at all the excursions, look at the housing, look at transportation for the program. And so really working very closely with the student and also with our Office of Services for Students with Disabilities to figure out how best to support the student on the program and make sure that all their needs were going to be met. And, it was really close collaboration with that office, with the student, with the faculty leader, and with our host institution in Mexico City to kind of make sure all of those accommodations and needs were going to be met. And lots of lessons learned for us throughout that process for sure. But that's sort of how I got my introduction to working with students with disabilities, and specifically in the study abroad arena. And we then continued that relationship with the Office of Services for Students with Disabilities and hosted a specific information session for students with disabilities who are interested in going abroad. And I also had the opportunity to serve on a diversity abroad task force related to disability access and inclusion. So that was really my introduction.
That's great. And Laura, in part, like one of the things that came out of that was, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a sort of a staff in the study abroad office that was set up as a liaison to the Disability Resource Center. Is that right? The way they weren't it wasn't like a full-time position. It was a hat that somebody was assigned to wear.
That's right. So that was sort of when I was in that role, I took on, in my position as a study abroad program coordinator, became also the liaison for services for students with disabilities, so that if any students came to our office and were looking for assistance, I was sort of the point person, even if I wasn't managing that specific program, so I could work with their coordinator and figure out, kind of share the lessons learned and how the best process for how to support the students with disabilities to do education abroad programs.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Great. And Erika.
Sure. So I can talk about a recent student of ours who had brittle bones and was interested. So for our fellowship, the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, you pursue a project of your own choosing for a year. She was interested in following performers and interested in improv, and had gone to Canada, Italy, and Australia for her year. She was also that year a new wheelchair user. And typically we do not grant deferrals for our program. So once you are awarded as a graduating senior, you usually have to decide if you're going to take the fellowship the following year or not. But we were able to grant this student a medical deferral for them to start their year a year later. And they were able to complete their year. I think some of the things that came up during that time was, as I mentioned, she was a new wheelchair user. And so she was navigating a few different countries and contexts where she had come up against cobblestones for the first time, or wasn't able to use her wheelchair at a certain point because of an injury to her hand. and so had to figure out how to navigate the city without using her wheelchair, even though she had done most of her year already with one. So just a couple of different kind of accommodations that had arose for her.
That's great. Erika, so you kind of mentioned like the student encountered, it was kind of her first time using a wheelchair, and even actually sometimes we've seen when students, when it's not really their first time, sometimes they can just, you use the, you get accustomed to your community, to your situation, and you can kind of forget that it's not the same way everywhere else. So even we've seen students who have been using wheelchairs for a long time, like maybe like Hugo Trevino, who gets surprised even, they wouldn't even anticipate what they're going to encounter. But like as the student was kind of working through these issues, trying to learn how to navigate her communities, were there any informational resources that the Watson Foundation found useful in supporting the student, any organizations to connect the student with, or any types of like access guide type resources or anything?
Great question. So I'll speak to that for two fellows. So for this particular fellow,
Sure.
her interest was also in bodies and in disabled bodies as well, and how they create art across the world. And so she, I think, was able to leverage a lot of the places that she was visiting. And we have that as the case for a few of our fellows. We've also had a fellow with hearing loss who is also exploring how to understand how people around the world value and understand hearing loss and kind of their daily circumstances. And so they were working with universities, working with athletic groups. And so a lot of that was baked into what they had created for themselves, the itineraries that they had made for themselves. Part of the fellowship is that we trust fellows to make plans that we think will work for them. So they choose all the places that they're going to go to. They choose all the contacts that they will make at those places. If you don't want to, if you don't want to go to a place because it turns out that one of our fellows broke their leg, for instance, one of our deaf fellows broke their leg and didn't want to go to another country. They didn't want to move out of the country that they were in. And so they wanted to stay in place. And we're happy for them to do that. They get to make that own their decision for themselves.
Thanks, Erika. That's great. Those are great examples. One of the things that kind of came up for me actually when you mentioned about like you going back to the first student, you made a slight policy change so that the student could defer and that was kind of a little bit different. I wonder if you could, sometimes I think what happens programs, and this is not just in the international education sector, it's also in domestic programs too. There's always a challenge of like, how do you balance sort of integrity and sort of academic excellence, you know, with providing accommodations. And what they'll tell you is kind of what we've heard legal like ADA coordinator folks say is you focus on what are the essential requirements, what are the motives of a requirement. And so this might be a little bit left of center maybe, but I wonder if you could maybe maybe if you could offer some comment about like in looking at the decision of whether to make a policy change for the student to allow the student to defer, what was the original intent of that requirement by the Watson Foundation, and how did you kind of conclude that this wouldn't like set a precedent for maybe non-disabled students?
Great question. So I would say that we have over a long time valued graduating seniors specifically for the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship. It is typically a year that we've timed with the year right after graduation. So for students who have gotten a job offer for that year, or they've gotten into graduate school for that year, we ask that they defer those opportunities and take the Watson as this really meaningful and purposeful gap between when you finish your college experience and before you have a different position afterwards. So I would say that's kind of how we value the timing of it. We've certainly since COVID have made a couple of different deferral related policies, only because there was at least March 2020 no chance for us to send fellows out into the world. And so since then we've made many deferrals for fellows and offered that as a policy. But it was one that we were able to give to this one student. And we have the ability to work one-on-one with students and to make requests of our board, and being able to work in that flexibility, I think, is an enormous part of the fellowship and of the opportunity. We can talk more about funding as well later on.
We'll get more about that later on, and that's great. Yeah, it sounds like, if the Watson, you guys can kind of respond to the changing times, but it sounds like, even despite the fact that you made this policy change for the student before the pandemic, kind of the essential point of it was that you're catching students at that cusp point between their undergrad and whatever comes next, and you were still able to do that with the student. It was just a year later, and it worked out. That's great. Laura, could you tell us what and I guess this can be for any student, not just a first student, but what informational resources does help UT to provide what students request?
Sure. So for us, definitely, we have used some Mobility International resources. In this particular situation, there's a fantastic checklist that goes through sort of all the needs that students have, like the needs that they might have in their housing. So like, do they need a shower, like bar? Do they need like a special, like a seat in the bathroom, and just all kinds of things that maybe the student hadn't even thought of, and to make sure that we have those things in place in the housing. And, are they going to have access to make sure that they can store any equipment that they need in a safe place? Or, what about if something gets broken and it needs to be repaired? So that checklist was a real helpful tool for us in supporting students they're traveling abroad, making sure that we're thinking through all these things, and that the provider is understanding what all of the needs are that have to be met. And for us, also just a close collaboration, again, as I mentioned, with our Office of Services for Students with Disabilities. So, really talking to them about, when it comes to things like policies and what's the student's responsibility versus what is the responsibility of the program to provide. We kind of talked with our counterparts in that office, and their guidance was, you need this, anything that the student is responsible for paying for themselves on the UT Austin campus should be mirrored when they're having an exchange or an education abroad experience. So that was helpful in guiding us through the process. But we did look at certain aspects of the program that, like, for example, the UT Austin campus was very accessible in terms of, not needing any type of special type of transportation, because there was like curb cuts and wheelchair access for all buildings. So when we were looking at the university in Mexico City, we saw that that wasn't the same case. So we determined that we needed to provide special transportation for the student, and that we were actually going to be paying for that out of the core budget of our education abroad fund. So it wasn't paid for by the program funds that the other students in the program were paying into, but we used a separate source of funding that, fortunately, as a big university, we had some additional funds we were able to dedicate to that particular need. So in that case, we hired a driver to provide transportation for the student, because we recognized that the other students would be able to walk to campus back and forth, but that wasn't going to be possible for the student that we were supporting in a wheelchair, and we wanted to make sure that they had the same level of access that they would have if they were on the UT Austin campus. So we tried to mirror that experience. So that's just sort of some of the steps that we took in determining how best to support the student.
Thank you, Laura. And Teneisha, what about you? And kind of going back to your earlier experience, what kinds of resources, when Hugo came to you, like what kinds of resources did you use to sort of find out the answers that you and him needed in order to figure out how he would participate in the program?
Which is surprising. So University of Illinois has a dorm called Beckwith that is very accessible, 24-hour service for students and things like that. And we wanted the same level. So Illinois has about 11 different campuses that are owned by Illinois. So it was more going to these different sites, trying to make sure that if we need to widen access to a door or add a rail for the bathroom, or making sure that the student had all their, if they're in the wheelchair, had all their classes on the first floor, or if they're hearing impaired, making sure the teachers knew to turn around instead of looking at the board and talking, or, you know, certain accommodations. And there was a listing of, like, we talked to the student, disability services, and myself, and then also the student would allow the disability services and education abroad office to talk when they're not there, you know, for the personal kind of things. We want to make sure that everything is in place. And so we tried to make it as accommodating as possible, that it felt like they were still on University of Illinois campus. Safety wise, making sure, like I mentioned before, if we needed a car to be hired, rented. Again, I was in UK. Rented for the student. You could go back and forth to school. Activities. There were alternative activities where all students could be involved in, either if there was a mountain climbing that day. Not everyone could do that. So they gave the students an option if they want to do this or do the alternative with the director, so that everyone felt included.
It's great. So Teneisha, like what, so it sounds to me like kind of what your kind of the information that you were looking for was just in general, like what kinds of accommodations do students with disabilities need, and then you'd be able to kind of take subsequent steps to provide those accommodations in the international context, or at least to find alternatives. And the sources that you used for that were the Disability Resource Center, and interestingly the student housing, right? So that's great. So how did you?
I can't emphasize enough though, letting us know early on, so the transition is as smooth as possible. No bumps, and usually it's the parents of the student who have the biggest problem with them going by themselves. So
did the University of Illinois ever figure out any like kind of strategies for getting students to disclose early in a timely manner?
Basically it was more just bringing it up, and disability services helped a lot because they needed to know, like, equipment that they needed or things like that they could easily rent for free from disability services. And of course, if something broke, and we tried to get the students to kind of like be forthcoming, but we would be in the office with them, giving them support if they wanted to talk to parents, because we allowed them to see host parents beforehand, or parents involved with the process as well. And it worked out very, very well. We also needed the students to sometimes disclose, depending on, for example, if we had a visually impaired student and their roommate was sightseeing. So if they couldn't move couches, they couldn't like move things around a little bit, and they understood that, and they made the agreement as well. So the earlier that you let your advisor know, the earlier that we can make accommodations. Or are you okay with like little flexibilities within those accommodations?
That's great. Yeah. I mean, did you find, and Hugo told you he was kind of afraid you wouldn't let him go once you found out he had disability. Do you know if his parents had that worry at all?
No, his parents wanted him to do as much as possible. And after he was the catalyst for the Enabled Abroad program. After that, before he graduated, he went 4 other places.
Enabled Abroad was kind of a pretty good creative way of funding reasonable accommodations. Could you tell us about that?
It was actually voted on by the student population. So again, I told you there was over 50,000 students, and there's like fees and things that are associated with the like university life. And the student body actually voted on $2 of each of their fees going toward this scholarship called Enabled Abroad. So into a huge pool. So like if someone needed extra leg room because they were missing a leg, or they needed an extra wheelchair to go with them, or an aid to go with them, that money came from the student body voting on it, and it wasn't just like made up by the school.
That's great. I mean, that's great. Did you like, how did you get that decision put out to the I guess kind of each university, you'd have your procedures and kind of however you need to do that. I remember when I was in college, we'd sometimes sign petitions, an extra $3 of tuition a year, and then you support this environmental initiative or something like that. So it sounds like kind of you were able to actually get a lot of funding just by having everybody agree to pay an extra couple bucks, basically. For exchange
basically
programs.
the student body president. That was one of the one person campaigned for it. I can't mention enough the help that we had with disability services and the fact that they wanted their students to go abroad, and they invited us to come into their talks to talk about like furthering enabled abroad. And every year, and then one of our faculty actually developed a program that allowed for wheelchairs in South Africa. And every other summer, that was like one of the highlights for a lot of students that wanted to go abroad in the first place.
It's great. And going back to Laura, you mentioned UT. I mean, you being a university, you guys had funding sources. Were there any steps that had to be taken in order to secure, a dedicated funding source, or did you guys kind of just agree to have funding for supports abroad to kind of come from the general pool that is used for accommodations?
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely on a case by case basis. So this was a specific case where we identified a need and determined that we had funds that we could pay for it. So there's not. I mean, we have a lot of scholarship funding available, but there's not dedicated funds, to my knowledge, set aside in the same way, which I think is great. You have those funds available. We do have the similar thing where there's an international education fee scholarship. So we have student tuition funds that have been dedicated for international education, but not specifically like for supporting disability access. But in this case, it was sort of determined that, we had the funds and wanted to support it, but it is definitely, like I said, case by case basis, and also assessing, like I said before, what's the responsibility of the student versus what would be something that, in this case, the university had decided to fund. And an important, I think, distinction that guidance we received from the services for students with disabilities is that anytime a student is hiring sort of like an aide or things like that, that's usually their personal responsibility. So that type of thing wouldn't be paid for by the university, similar to how, if they're hiring that sort of assistance at their home, at our home university, it's the student's responsibility to pay for those things. So I think it's a kind of, case by case basis, but there is some funding, or at least at this point in time. This was a little while ago, so of course the landscape has changed. That was there to support.
So by we, it sounds like kind of what you're saying when you say we, you're meaning the study abroad office.
Yeah, it was for this case. It was a discussion with like my supervisor, who was in charge of all the faculty-led programs, and then the director of education abroad overall, to determine how to fund this particular expense.
That's great. Okay. So I mean, there you have two kind of examples of, University of Illinois sort of framed this as a scholarship, but it was a scholarship dedicated for reasonable accommodation supports, and then UT kind of funding it, sounds like through your global exchange type programs. And then what about Erika, though? Watson Foundation's a bit different. You're not a university, you're, correct me if I'm wrong, a foundation. And how did you guys handle that?
Just to clarify, how did we handle funding?
Yeah, how did you arrange a funding pool for reasonable accommodations?
Sure. So we budget for it every year, and have, I think historically it was the $10,000 budget per student was for married couples. And so you would request, if you would like for your year to bring your partner, you would get an additional stipend. And I think in the 60s, it was like $2,000. And then at certain points over time, we'll reevaluate with kind of inflation and other markers that we're looking at from the market for how much the stipend should be. And then the $10,000 budget works much in the same way as the $36,000 award. So it's released when fellows are awarded. So that's in April. Yes, in April of every year, and then they leave in August. And we ask for a financial accounting of the stipend and the budget at the end of the fellowship, so August of the following year. And it's not an itemized accounting. We ask for categories of amounts that were spent. So, living expenses, groceries, equipment, things like that.
Eric, I heard you mention the 60s. It sounds like this has been around for a while. Remind me, what did it, so did this start off as a disability accommodation, or was it like a, because did you say like it was like a dependent type support, or?
It started off as a dependent type support and then has been used for both to support spouses as well as accommodations. We've also had fellows not request the $10,000 budget and just use their $36,000 stipend.
Yeah.
And so it really depends on the case.
Yeah, I could see how if somebody was going to like a middle or lower income country too, like that, just the 36,000 could probably go pretty far.
Yeah, that is something that we take into consideration for all of the fellows. If you're traveling to a number of lower income countries, or if you're traveling to a number of countries just in Europe, there's a big difference budget wise.
That's great. Yeah, and it stood out to me. You mentioned it. I thought I heard you mention it was originally a spousal type support, and we've seen other foundations, including some really well-known programs offering like dependent type benefits, spousal benefits. We knew a person who received a dependent benefit for her 5-year-old son when she came to earn a master's degree in the US. We've seen other examples of and it's interesting how, like, you were talking about how you guys were able to start with these as dependent type benefits or spousal benefits, but then they were diverted to a reasonable accommodation purpose. So sometimes, for professionals, you might have a benefit similar to this that you might be thinking about. You might try diverting it, for a reasonable accommodation use. Even if it doesn't completely cover costs, it can certainly offset them. And if there are any, I know the audience here mainly is professionals, but if there are any students listening to, it's definitely worthwhile considering if you're negotiating accommodations with a foundation to ask them about any dependent type or spousal type supports that might be able to be redirected towards your purposes. So let's go back to Teneisha, and students can, how do you guys manage student expectations around reasonable accommodations? Sometimes students might anticipate there's more access abroad than maybe normally, or maybe they might anticipate that you have more responsibilities maybe than, maybe they might expect that you're going to cover a little more than you would, or than you should have to. How do you kind of clarify their expectations and and make sure that they don't go in with kind of excessive hopes.
And that's I think that's every student that goes abroad. In reality, they have these amazing, like, this is going to be a diamond in the rough kind of place, but we try to very much so, like, keep it like up forefront. What you have access here is honestly even sometimes better than what you have in the United States. The access at Beth with, like, the sidewalks that talk, that all these things we want to make their expectations high, but not so high that you believe that the world is going to change for you. That doesn't happen for anybody. And very honest upfront about that. And the Disability Service Office tells them the same thing. You might have housing that wasn't expecting. Maybe it's smaller than what you were expecting, or it doesn't meet the level that you have had in the United States. It depends on where you're going. That's the whole goal of going abroad and discovering other new and exciting cultures, is being open to things that are different. You're not going to be there forever. We would never place you in a location that's dangerous. Keep that in mind. We care about you. We're definitely going to make sure that the accommodations meet with what you're looking for. And if not, is there a way that you can be flexible? Just like any other student. Flexibility is very, very important in the process. As I mentioned before, we had a student who was hearing impaired. And just the one thing that she needed, one thing, she could have easily asked for a machine that allowed her to hear a little bit better, or asking a teacher to turn around when they spoke made a world of difference. We need to know up front what's going on, and we tell that in pre-departure. We tell that on one-on-one activities. We try to push the fact that this is maybe like once in a lifetime opportunity, but like take every advantage you can. And it helps you to be more flexible in your everyday life as well.
That's great, Teneisha. Appreciate it. Yeah, I would say that I personally studied abroad as a blind student in South America, and there weren't, I definitely did get supports, but while my supports at home were books that were scanned and digitalized, abroad they were human readers and the right to use the photocopy machine to scan texts myself in the exchange center, and those worked. And but I did a lot of research beforehand, and and kind of just learning about what was going to come up. That was how I was able to manage it. So
we definitely give the students a lot of resources as well, historical facts about the location, because as you know, disability services is not the same everywhere.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, you would be surprised how encouraging you are to students who actually live in these locations, who have never seen someone going off independently by themselves to have a drink or like going out. You're encouraging them as well. Remember that.
That's true. That's great. Actually, yeah. And what about Laura? How does UT kind of manage student expectations?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that helps us is in a lot of cases, sometimes we do, if we're going to a new site, we do a site visit. So that would help me to communicate expectations to students about what they're actually going to be seeing and experiencing. So I went to go visit Mexico City, and I could see that, a lot of the sidewalks, even if there were sidewalks, it was all broken up. And, like even, as a able-bodied person, sometimes walking around was somewhat, and navigating the sidewalks was challenging. Or, so I think if you're able to go and kind of have take pictures of the actual housing and show the students, that helps to really manage their expectations a lot more and have a good understanding of their actual experience. And anytime that I ever conducted a site visit, my goal was to do all the things that students were going to do. So like get on the public transportation, or to walk from the housing to the university, and eat in the dining hall, and try to make sure that I could understand what the students were going to be experiencing, and then communicate that realistic expectation to them. And of course, if it's not possible to go and do that in person, it really helps to have your partners on the ground kind of try to fill in some of those gaps, and have them do a pre-departure orientation with the students where they talk to them about what's the housing like, what's access or transportation like in this particular location. So I do think that is important, and part of the pre-departure process for students is to help them to kind of have a somewhat realistic expectation and understand the realities of what they're going to be experiencing when they get there. Of course, when they arrive, there's going to be so much that you haven't prepared them for, because it's such a overwhelming experience in some cases. But to best prepare them and try to understand what the realities they're going to be seeing when they arrive in that particular location. And it was very helpful for me to going like Teneisha said, if upfront that you're working on a program and there's students that have specific accommodation needs, that you can kind of look at that specifically while you're conducting a site visit, or ask your partner to partner organization abroad to fill those in for you, and to give you some specifics around those accessibility issues.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, and actually, like I know you mentioned like about surveying for access abroad. My colleague Ashley, I believe earlier, shared a checklist of access considerations, and that can be a helpful reference. Actually, earlier in the conference last week, we heard from Peggy Ritkar from University of Minnesota. Their institution recently actually put together information for both professionals and for students on not only what kinds of accommodations to review with a student, or not only as like a sample reasonable accommodation form that a student and a disability advisor would work on together to prepare for a program, but also sample survey forms that a study abroad advisor and a host center staff could utilize to gather accessibility-based information about the host site. So of course, many of you may have host staff abroad. You might have advisors like Laura Caloudas, or folks like Laura Caloudas or Colludas going abroad and surveying, and there are sample forms out there, which Ashley's just posted to the chat on, that'll kind of give you an idea of what sorts of things should you look for. So I think those can be really, really helpful to kind of know what you're looking for. And we had a great question earlier for Erika about broadly speaking, the $10,000 was originally a spousal benefit. The question was, what would happen if a person there was a person with a disability who needed they needed the benefit diverted to reasonable accommodation expenses, say like a PCA or something, but then they also wanted to take their spouse with them. How does Watson approach that?
So I would say that one of our experiences has been to remain incredibly flexible about the $10,000 stipend. And so that's kind of being able to revisit it throughout the year. And if the student needed additional funds, being able to provide the funding.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And I just want to let folks know we're in our last 15 minutes. So if anybody else has any questions and you chat them to the box, I'll go ahead and ask those. But meanwhile, I'll go back to my questions. And I'm going to ask, and I don't know, this may or may not be a question for the folks here, but let's go back to Erika. Many programs budgets have taken quite a hit over the last year as numbers have, as enrollments and conversions have gone down. And what are your thoughts about steps programs can take in the face of maybe less than standard staffing or funding?
Yeah, so I would say that something that we were revisiting is just if there's rainy day funding that's available kind of in different department budgets. So sometimes the university will have a kind of a separate budget or something that's set under diversity and inclusion specifically for rainy day, and just to see if there's anything that campuses can do kind of across the universities in order to provide the same level of programming.
Thank you, Erika. And before I go on to Laura, I just, if anybody listening in the audience has any thoughts about this question, go ahead and chat. We'd love to hear your ideas. Laura, what do you think? How has UT maybe had to handle this? Or what are your thoughts about how institutions might handle this? And I'm sure that, we're talking with organizations here that at least maybe even if not in the last year, certainly in the last, in your history, you've faced, funding changes. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think definitely, like sort of everyone else in the ed abroad field, we've faced a lot of, challenges over the past year plus with the pandemic, and saw shrinking staff numbers and obviously numbers of students going abroad. But I think what's historically been really successful for us is really viewing this, what we were talking about before, like this liaison role of having somebody to be in that role as kind of like it's sort of like a professional development opportunity. And that's definitely how I experienced it, and felt that, to be able to enhance your skills as, an education abroad provider by understanding better the needs of a specific group of students, and being able to increase the diversity and inclusion of your office by enhancing that skill set, I think is an advantage. It is hard when, the organizations right now are facing a lot of like reduced staff and there's maybe not as much capacity to do those types of activities, but that was sort of what was, I think, helpful for us. And, you know, in some cases, some staff members, you know, specialize in working with first generation college students. Some staff members focused on, you know, partnering with other, you know, diverse groups that maybe traditionally haven't had as much access to education abroad. And it was sort of an overall mission of like, let's try to become more inclusive and gain, you know, provide more access opportunities for students who haven't had these opportunities in the past. So yeah, just I think that's what my experience was looking at this, like, this is a way for me to develop professionally by understanding and supporting, you know, a traditionally underrepresented group in study abroad. And that was sort of how we approached it.
Kind of a mindset. Tanisha, what do you think?
So actually the money was earmarked for this. So the funding towards that enabled abroad is always going to be there. It's the additional funding that some students need is the problem. That was specifically made for that purpose, to like, that is why we ask students to vote on it. And so that money stays where it belongs.
Budget for RA, and if you're a university, that's kind of neat that you have that that legislative body where you can get the students to agree. So it's not even something you're imposing on them. So that's great. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think like going back to what Laura was saying, I mean, Teneisha, that's great budgeting for accommodations. We have resources on that. We recommend, you know, between, like you said, like say, you know, between 2 and 5% or so of operating budget, and of course, and then but also, yeah, it's about mindset. I mean, a while back, we heard of an entity that was working with a partner, and there was a student who needed an accommodation, and the partner was kind of just, because of the pandemic, I think the partner was really stressed, and they were kind of shutting up and not really wanting to dialogue with the entity about the accommodation. And but the accommodation wasn't going to cost anything even. And so sometimes it's just kind of keeping an open mind and can open it to dialogue.
Well, there was once where, so we had a student who was just a student going abroad and was only staying for a semester, and she became a disability student while she was abroad. So she ended up staying a semester, so that money, she fell and like broke her tailbone to the point where they were afraid her spine on a plane would shatter. So the doctors had her stay there for an extra semester. So we were able to provide aid for her as well during physical therapy and rehab and things like that. So I mean, that it's specifically for that reason.
Nice. That's great. Thanks, Tanisha. And let's see. Well, we are now at 10 minutes to the end of the session. So if anybody has any questions, I'd definitely like to invite any follow-ups for the panelists. Let's go back to Erika. Erika, how do you hope that the COVID-19 pandemic will change the way that you provide exchange programs in the future?
Great question. So I think one of the things that we're doing right now is really, really personalized pre-departures. So every country and state is going to be different, and then each of our fellows' comfort levels is different. So we now have one-on-one orientations that we're doing with each fellow instead of just doing it with the group as we would typically. And that's just built into the programming now. I would also say that something that we've been thinking about is how we figure out what we want to be in person and what we want to be remote. So our fellowship, the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, is very, very much based in interactions and exchange outside of the United States. And so how fellows are able to make those contacts. So in order to apply, you have to have come up with a number of people and organizations that you will be with in the following year. And that opportunity is for students to test their ideas, to see how realistic their year is going to be, and then for us to be able to see a little bit of what they're planning to do for the year. And students were, for this past year, very, very nervous about contacting people internationally because they weren't sure what COVID situations people were dealing with at home and then in the places that they were in. But what we learned was that after, even though we were getting so many of those emails and questions for students, what we learned afterwards was that students actually had kind of an easier time this year in their outreach than they have in pretty much any other instance. They were people that were responding and supporting the students that would likely not have come up in a previous year. So we had one student who was proposing a sustainable architecture project, and she was able to join a professional association as a senior and was able to attend their conference for free because it was virtual and online. And she never would have been able to do something like that in a different year. And so thinking about how that is going to be a part of our programming and a part of the student experience from now on, because there is kind of some comfort or some more comfort for some students in being remote.
These were students that were pre-application. They were kind of doing their pre-application work.
Yeah, these were students who were, yes, reaching out to people around the world in their application process.
That's great.
Yep.
That's great. Hopefully, like in the future, kind of following the pandemic, hopefully kind of as we become more accustomed to using Zoom and Microsoft Teams and speaking to people, collaborating with people far away, that suddenly maybe in the future, our international colleagues will be more opened, like you said, to kind of speaking with outreach from people who are from abroad. What do you think, Laura? What is UT kind of looking forward to after the pandemic in terms of maybe good things that might come out of this?
Yeah, so I can speak specifically with my program because we had a huge pivot to virtual. We had groups that we were ready to send abroad that had already bought plane tickets and things in March of 2020 and had to take the big shift to pivot their projects to be virtual. So, I mean, in this case, it's a bit different because it is project-based work. I mean, it's not too dissimilar from an internship in some ways, because you're working with, in some cases, they were working with universities abroad, or they were working with nonprofit organizations in other countries. But we were really excited to see that it could work and that a lot of things could still be accomplished in the virtual format. So it actually made us kind of rethink the entire model of the specific award that that I administer and look at how can we really leverage like this virtual component of collaborating with international partners, whether it be university partners or other types of organizations. And, we still want to include a travel component because I think, there's a lot that can be done virtually, but of course, not everything can be accomplished. And we had some groups, actually, I have some that are currently abroad. This was the first time we sent students back out for my program, but some countries it was just not possible to do it. So I think for the next several years, that's going to continue to be the case where it might be possible to travel some places, other places won't be as this pandemic continues on and looks very different in different places in the world. But the opportunity to shift to virtual collaboration for us opened a lot of doors and made it, I think, so that we could continue the program under the conditions that we're all currently facing and just really find ways to be creative, innovative, flexible. So I think to take those lessons learned into the future. And I do think it is interesting to me, the idea of, what kinds of increased access can this offer for students with disabilities that might not have the opportunities to travel currently. How can we still have that increased global engagement and, cross-cultural learning? And I think since we've seen such a shift globally to doing things virtually, we can hopefully try to leverage that and offer more opportunities for all students to learn virtually when it's still going to be a challenge, I think, for a while to be traveling.
I think you could venture kind of a guess as to like kind of the percent of the programs that you're seeing that are virtual right now.
Like that we have the programs that we've had that have flipped to virtual. I don't know off the top of my head, but
Okay.
I would say, we had like maybe 25%. If I was just guessing, I know that we've seen some that have flipped virtual and then some others that have been kind of put on hold depending on, the logistics of the specific program. And there are virtual exchanges too. I'm mainly talking about, like faculty-led and other kinds of customized programming.
Makes sense. Yeah. Which tend to be kind of more shorter term and which tend to be more thematically focused versus like students taking classes towards a major, for example.
Yeah. Although I know we did have students do virtual exchanges as well during the pandemic, and that was something that students engaged in.
That's great. That's great. That's great. And you mentioned about also like the benefits for access too. And I see we've got a question in the chat too about, how can virtual exchange be kind of an access tool to give students with disabilities or minority students more access to overseas programs. And I know it sounds like UT is kind of, you guys are thinking about it from a point of view of, well, it's good for now, like as an alternative, because while students can't really go abroad. Teneisha, I know you're doing your PhD thesis on how the pandemic has and how virtual exchange has impacted the field. Do you have any thoughts about that question about access and virtual exchange and the role, how virtual exchange might be used in a post-pandemic future, or how it might not be used?
So yeah, we are actually looking towards the future. I cannot speak for Illinois and what they're doing right now, but my research is basically based on the transition within the pandemic. Has it added access to people who had families or jobs or things like that, and was it a successful resource? So I'm in the process of all that now, but preliminary like just interviews and things have shown that there is still a component missing. And if we can find that piece, the advancement of computer programming that can maybe enhance cultural education or emotional intelligence while on a virtual exchange program, that would be outstanding. That's like years from now. That's something else I'm working on. But at the moment, and these are like self-selected students who have wanted to tell their stories and how the transition either fall 19 to 2020, the year, or like actually going on just virtual exchange programs, how that's changed their perspective on the culture or the people or interactions or connections that they make while online.
It's great. It seems like kind of what you're hopefully like Facebook or somebody else is going to come up with some more extensive virtual tools that'll allow us to more interact with communities abroad or remote places. But it sounds like kind of right now it's like virtual exchange.
We're doing the best we can.
We're doing the best we can. And there are certain like collaboration opportunities, like at the sense of, in terms of like, if you have, say, students from Nebraska and students from Egypt working on a architecture project together over Zoom, but then like that sort of, but sometimes though, when you're abroad, it's kind of the odd things that happen when you're, at the bar or in the park or something that aren't really planned, right? That students still kind of lose.
A lot of the students tended to do Discords, or like they did separate things outside of classroom time. They showed initiative. The ones I've talked to so far, if there's a writing retreat, they did it themselves. They put a WhatsApp group together because they were missing that connection piece. And they all tried to do different time zones, so it felt like they were still studying abroad.
That's great. That's great. That's great. Well, everybody, we're at the hour right now. I want to ask Monica, do you think that we have maybe a couple minutes for to invite questions? I haven't heard anything. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is Monica. I don't see any questions that have come in, so we can pause for just 1 or 2 minutes to see if there's anything coming in before we sign off.
Sounds great. And meanwhile, while we wait, Monica, can you tell them about the next session that's coming up?
Yeah, and just this afternoon, we've got some of our disability community rooms coming up, and that is at 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. And today we've got our deaf and hard of hearing community room, and then our non-apparent disabilities community room. I also shared in the chat box that Hugo Trevino, the one that Teneisha was mentioning, and we've shared in the chat box, he will be featured during our Disability and Identity Abroad session tomorrow from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. So I hope you can join for that one. And then we've got 2 more community rooms tomorrow afternoon for the blind community room and the physical and mobility disabilities community room.
That's great, Monica. So in an hour, folks, join us for breakout sessions. It's going to be really interesting. I think that one of the things we're always looking for is how do we do more specific, how do we talk about more specific disabilities? And for you professionals out there, I mean, sometimes we can talk about disability like it's a monolith, but everybody's experience is really pretty different. And so this is kind of a chance for us to facilitate more of that disability specific dialogue. And does anybody have any, before we kind of leave, does anybody have any thoughts about how we can sort of tackle some of our unconscious biases about disability? You could probably approach that too with other minority groups as well. Does anybody, can any of our panelists weigh in on that?
Sorry, what was the question?
So how do you tackle kind of unconscious bias towards students with disabilities? How do staff, like, imagine like trainings or could be, I don't know, I'm not sure. What do you think, Teneisha?
I think one of the things, I mean, I had no training whatsoever on this topic when it happened. I was so young when we first started this out. But one of the big things is Hugo actually helped me. He told me like, oh, like I would do a presentation and he'd be in the back of the room, don't say that, or like, don't do that. Or he'd give me a little feedback, and I got that from disability services, because before I had never even experienced a student. Before 2012, I had never experienced a student wanting to go abroad. I had over 50,000 students working all in the same location. So it's a lot of asking for help when you definitely need it. And then I actually was the resident advisor abroad with disabilities with Juanita. I don't know if Lily, a while back, we did a presentation together, and we offered scholarships. So I was just kind of like the advisor that people talk to. And I became the lead advisor, because it was just like, no matter what country, I was in charge of Spanish countries. But then all of a sudden I was in charge of the world when it came to students who wanted disability access. And Beckwith became, disability services in Illinois, and our office became very, very close. So.
Teneisha took over the world. Did you hear that, everybody?
I like you.
Maybe you'll do it this weekend. That's great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Teneisha. It sounds like kind of the way you did it is you were just open to dialogue and open to correction, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think my advice for somebody is I would ask, like, when sometimes I think professionals will make kind of pre-assumptions like, oh, the student is going to be unsafe in this program. They might fall down a stair, or they might get attacked by a wild animal, or this student is, going to be miserable because they're not going to be able to take a walk out on, because there's no wheelchair, there's no curb cuts, but I think you gotta kind of have that sort of internal awareness to realize when some of that dialogue is really coming from you and not from the student. So
and also reminding the student to please be as careful as possible, even if this happened years ago, but we had a student who they were climbing on a hill and there was not a room for a wheelchair. He paid a farmer to attach his chair to the back of his tractor. Don't do that. Like, after we found out, like there's just things I know you would like to do, but on the safety side, let's not try that. Okay.
Students are risk takers. That's great. Yeah. So anyway, that's I think that's our crack at that answer. And with that, everybody, we are now at 5 after the hour. So everybody, go ahead and get a drink, get some lunch, and we'll hopefully see you in 55 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you.